the moral, the ethical, the intellectual, the astral, the cosmic, the celestial, house not made with hands.
The alchemical axiom or principle of vitriol. Visita interiora terrae, rectificando inveniis occultum lapidum. Visit the interior of the earth, and rectifying therein, you will find the hidden stone.
You know, if you don't transmute yourself first, you will transmute nothing.
The axiom of fixing the volatile and volatilizing the fixed.
Being able to weave hermetic principles into our social fabric.
Filling in the fractal spaces till we get to the most rarefied abstract plane of the celestial realm.
You know, that's alchemy, that's understanding nature.
Question everything.
Symbols are far beyond words, right? Symbols are the touch point where the mind enters into the sublime, incomprehensible, translinguistic depths of a direct connection with the ultimate that I would refer to as the divine.
There is truth in the Western esoteric traditions. It has been contributed to and refined and evolved over the course of millennia by what we can conceive universally to be the greatest minds to ever exist.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Philosophical Minds Podcast, an exploration of all things philosophical, alchemical, and esoteric. From the psycho-spiritual to the material-chemical nature of the all, join me and my guests as we inquire into the liminality of mind and matter and tend to the fertile soils of awareness and perception while facilitating an expanded consciousness from the individual to the collective. Thank you all, and let's get into it. All right. Welcome to another episode of Philosophical Minds Podcast. This evening, I am joined with Jose Gabriel Alegría Sabogal. Sorry if I butchered that. Try my best. No Jose is a Berlin-born art historian, author, and artist. Some of his areas of focus include colonial art, religious iconography, Sanskrit philology, and comparative religion. And he's just really just doing amazing work and sort of resurrecting and shedding light on otherwise forgotten historical knowledge and spiritual traditions and kind of imbibing these things with a whole new life. So I consider you to be doing invaluable work that's going to really open up a lot of people's eyes to, you know, things that they wouldn't otherwise have maybe come across. And I think it's really inspiring and motivating. Hopefully it'll encourage further exploration with a lot of these otherwise pretty esoteric inquiries. So you're doing important work, I feel. And so I'm aware that you studied in Peru. And the last time I looked, I saw that you were working on a PhD at Stony Brook University, New York. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And so in Peru, was that primarily art that you were studying?
Yeah, I studied first fine arts in Peru, and then I did my master's in art history. And then I started a PhD in Stony Brook in Hispanic languages, but I'm specializing in art history, colonial art history. And that took me to Rome, where I am right now, writing my dissertation. So it's been a long way, but here we are.
Nice place to be writing a dissertation.
Yeah, it's quite a privilege. Very happy.
Yeah. So you've got a few books of your own, A Second Nature, Yao, and then coming soon, the revamped edition coming out called, let me pronounce this correct, is it Semicilam?
Semicilam, yeah. Well, we don't really know how it's pronounced because it's just an inscription on Gnostic gems. So yeah, Semicilam is good for me, I think.
Or the Eternal Sun. And I believe that this is coming out at the same time with the new paperback edition of Yao. Beyond these, your artwork has also been featured in many other books by many notable authors. Your works have been published by Anathema, Scarlet Imprint, Mount Abraxas, Aeon Sophia Press, and much more. So I'm really looking forward to talking with you. But in terms of your background, is there anything that I missed or anything additional that you'd kind of like to add about yourself or your background?
I think that's good enough for now. But if something pops up, of course, I'll let you know.
Beautiful. So I came across your Yao book at one point, maybe it was like 5 months ago or so, and I just thought it looked really interesting and cool, like the cover, but I didn't really look into it too much. I kind of forgot about it, and then I was going down some rabbit holes researching different Gnostic sects and whatnot, and eventually got my curiosity sparked about the Ophites. And so I was trying to find more information and, researching the Ophites, and there wasn't a whole lot out there. And then my girlfriend was like, "Hey, check this book out. Have you seen this?" So she sent me a photo of the Yao book, and I think it was the cloth bound edition with it's like a Trishula looking Abraxas kind of thing. I really like that image. Yeah. I don't know if I'm accurately describing it.
It's a triple snake, right? Yeah, it's 3 snakes, basically. It's like one snake eating 2 others. But yeah, it actually looks like a trident, yeah.
Yeah, it's really cool. It really stood out to me. So yeah, when she sent me that, I was like, oh, wow. Yeah, I have seen that book, but I didn't realize it was about the Ophites. And I was like, I got to get this book. And by that time, it was already sold out. And I was like, damn it, I was so bummed out. But yeah, since then, I've become very interested in your work and kind of started checking out all of your incredible artwork on top of all that. And just amazing. So I absolutely want to get into the Ophites. But before we do, I just want to ask you a couple questions to get rolling here. I had listened to I think I found like 2 recordings of yours online. One was the Biblio, I think it was by Anathema. It was about your Yao book and whatnot. And I heard you mention your father in reference to him kind of conveying some things to you about Sanskrit. And I believe that you had said he taught philosophy, but there was sort of a little bit of a dissonance in terms of his approach versus your more mystical, like arcane bent. And I sort of have a similar relationship with my parents in terms of their religiosity versus my own more like kind of broad spectrum interests. So we've always had a bit of a clash and a little bit of an argumentation back and forth, which was kind of a double-edged sword because it definitely came with a great deal of frustration. But on the other side of it, I'm almost grateful because in many ways it really pushed me to refine my own spirituality. So I was curious and I wanted to ask you, would you say that in some ways your father had this sort of influence on you, kind of providing you with a little bit of back and forth resistance that you feel maybe kind of helped sharpen and refine your work and kind of wrestling out things? Or maybe I'm off on that, but I was curious about that.
No, definitely. It was like I don't know, like a point that you had to reach in order to have I don't know, the right to speak about something. Like you had to be prepared you had to know your stuff before you could say anything, because he was very academically demanding, I think, and maybe that's what got me to do that amount of effort on the Gnostics. And fun fact, it was actually him when I was, I think, quite young that he mentioned to me, because I was already interested in all kinds of cult stuff, as you do when you're young. He told me one day, like, you're like the Gnostics, that they have this sort of strange philosophical-ish ideas, but nobody really knows what they're talking about. Because, and I didn't even know what the Gnostics were back then. And after many years after hearing that, I remembered only the word, and I started looking at it, and I was like, yeah, maybe I am. I don't know. So yeah, by all means, I think it was a double-edged sort of I don't know, friendship, and also sort of this constant fight that you might have with your own dad, of course. But at the same time, as you mentioned Sanskrit, that's interesting because he mentioned it, he put this idea in my head that Sanskrit was the sort of root language for a lot of things and for a lot of religions. And that's when I actually, many years later, I actually met my Sanskrit professor. He already passed away. But the fun thing is that to me, my Sanskrit teacher was sort of my spiritual father, while my father was sort of my earthly father, so to speak. So there is interesting there is this idea in Gnostic texts as well that you can have the sons of the flesh are not the same thing as the sons of the spirit, and I think that applies also many times because sometimes you might have a different you can choose your own, so to speak. So but in that case, I think it did influence me a lot. The standards that I had to keep, so to speak, in order to be allowed to speak, and literally in that regard. So he was quite harsh in his own way, but I think that really made me, in many ways, what I am as an artist, so to speak, and also as an academic so far. So by all means.
Absolutely. Yeah, I admire and I respect your careful approach in terms of how you seem to go about conveying your work. It seems from what I've heard you speak about that you've kind of made it a point that you try to point out specifics without kind of adding too much bias and opinions about things, generally trying to avoid irresponsible postulation and whatnot, and trying to respect and remain true to accurately depicting these things and these traditions. And there was something you said, that there was a delicate sort of dance between, I think the words you used were between obedience and transgression. I don't know if you recall that, but I was hoping, I think it'd be cool if you could speak to that a little bit more and elaborate on what you meant by that and kind of your overall approach when it comes to your images and writing and the way that you like to go about things.
Yeah, I think that is a very interesting Gnostic pattern that we find in the texts. And I think that was also a ritual pattern, so to speak, that they have this sort of puzzling bipolarity, so to speak, between things that look as obeisance, as worship, and then transgressive rituals, transgressive passages. So, for example, in this poem, Thunder Perfect Mind, you have at the same time what could be even considered insulting and also very much words of worship, words of obeisance. And so they always have this strange bipolarity that you cannot even be certain if they are worshiping some deity or if they are insulting this deity at the same time. And that is also what you find in the text regarding the Ophite diagram in Origin, that the devotee, in this case, well, the initiate would be more accurate to say, is meant to sort of salute these different gods, these different devils or deities, and at the same time, he's just meant to do so that he can pass and go beyond and go somewhere else. So I think that's sort of a pattern of initiation, that once you pass a certain level, then they actually transgress again. And that is I think, a very interesting pattern. And that is also the pattern where I think the comparison with Tantra can be interesting, because the rituals can be both in that context transgressive, but they also require quite a lot of consistency ritual-wise and quite a lot of devotion, so to speak, to reach to a certain level. So I think phenomenologically in religion there was a similar pattern going on, so to speak. But as you mentioned, I always try to pinpoint very accurately what I think is an example of each thing without making wild connections. But I want to be also open when I am making my own wild connections, just saying, well, this is what I know, this is what I consider. We might consider this, but the idea is just there, that's, I think, you could say semi-academic approach that I like to keep.
Yeah.
Without being too cold, also, because if you go fully academic, sometimes you lose the taste of things, and that's also what I didn't want to sort of the mistake that I also wanted to avoid, to still be able to be creative.
Yeah, it's definitely a healthy balance, I think. So the Ophites, there's kind of a scarce amount of available material out there currently, and you've done a good service in helping, mitigate that how you can and kind of fill in that gap with your efforts and your dedication, and trying to provide some comprehension around this sect. So thank you for that. And so you've been able to, from my understanding, glean an understanding based on some French and German sources, and then you've constructed this beautiful, massive ophyte diagram that is kind of the centerpiece of your Yao work. So I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate a little bit on that, like the sources and where you drew information from, and where this inspiration for this ophyte diagram primarily came from, and all that.
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, the first translation that I got was in Spanish, the Gredos edition, made in Madrid. I think it's a very good one, as far as I've been able to check, of the works of Origen of Alexandria. So that was the primary source. That is still the primary source that we have. And despite the fact that people can be very critical, because since the Nag Hammadi library was discovered, the previous texts that we had, which were basically the heresiologists, so the controversial texts from the church fathers that wanted to oppose Gnosticism, those were the sources pre-Nag Hammadi, and they sort of fell into disuse, so to speak. They fell out of fashion because they were not direct sources of Gnosticism. They were always polemic. They were always trying to go against them quite openly. But I think Origen is super interesting because he really includes a crazy amount there, and he's the main source that we have on the ophytes. And of course, they do this. I mean, the church fathers that did this, they do the sort of stratification and qualification of what sect is what, and based on that, the Nag Hammadi library has been sort of scholars have been trying to separate which text in Nag Hammadi corresponds to which form of thinking in Gnosticism. But I don't really know if we can actually pinpoint this sect believe this and this sect believe that as a strict, sort of as a fixed canon, because just as with the Corpus Hermeticum, I think there might be within those patterns the same contradiction going on, that sometimes they can say something, and after an initiation, they can tell you the exact contrary. I think that was something also going on within Gnosticism that we can see in the texts themselves. But yeah, to me, the main one was Origen, of course. The work of Professor Campbell Bonner was very interesting because he actually identifies one gem that he says this should have been from the ophyte sect. It's a lion-headed man. It's a very interesting work that he does on that. Charles William King's Gnostics and the Remains was also a very important book, that one in English. But I think it's quite outdated, but I was sort of playful with it as well. I tried to make it open when I think some of his ideas are kind of wild but super interesting. So I try to use him creatively, because he actually makes a lot of very interesting connections and very erudite connections, because it's a Victorian book that can be very outdated scholarly, but still, I think, super interesting and super resourceful in all the erudition that he carries. There was a German book, especially devoted, but very short, on the ophyte diagram. And there was also this French book on the sources of Gnosticism, which were actually the visual ones, because they tried to make the circles within circles to create the diagram. So those were the charts that I was working from, more visually, more directly. And the problem there was that the first thing that Origen states in the primary source is that all the circles are within one bigger circle, essentially. So they all have to fit inside one circular thing, but none of the reconstructions can actually fit all of them inside one. Because when he starts explaining, it doesn't really add up. It doesn't really make sense, because once he finishes the first 7, then there are 7 more, and then there are 3 more, and it doesn't really add up. So I was really breaking my head for many years. So I wasn't daring how to just painstakingly try to fit them all into one. And my compromise was basically that I included the 7 extra ones horizontally. So that you can have, it's almost like a cross within the circle. You have 7 vertically, 7 horizontally, and then 3 more that are the upper spheres. That was my compromise. that's the compromise that I had to take to fit them all into one. And I haven't seen actually one reconstruction that fits them all in one even circle, in one nice circle, so to speak. So that is my risk, so to say. But yeah, that was sort of the work visually and the work academically, if you want to call it that way. But as you mentioned, actually the source is pretty restricted. It's basically origin, and you have to contrast it with as many sources that we can find. And then iconographically, my effort was trying to contrast the archons, which are these creatures that are on the gates, these different demigods that are monstrous, and there are this. They're a very strange, I think, I don't know, category of deity, if you can call it that way, because they are this semi-animal, supernatural creatures that try to stop you in your way of ascension. And so the other source was actually also an iconographic comparison. So trying to compare the Gnostic gems and the Gnostic iconography, if we can call it that way, with the animal-headed creatures that were mentioned by Origen. So how to visually represent them was actually based on the different surviving pieces that we have on cabinets and so on. And that is what I'm actually still working at, because it's still a very vast, I think, field of contrasting remains and contrasting sources. So yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I just kind of have been browsing around online, so I don't know how accurate what I come across is in terms of information, but there was, when I was reading a little bit about them, there was a term like they would say those who traverse the cosmos or something like that. And I think that is something that you're speaking to about kind of moving from those archonic, I don't know, planetary entities sort of, and then with the goal of sort of transcending that, I think. And there was something I read about their view. The door out of the cosmos was the constellation Draco, which was, it's a snake and another symbol of the Christ, which we can get into. But they also, I think they had some baptism rituals where they, used like an anointing, life-giving oil of some kind. In terms of what you've come across, like with their rites and rituals, what are some interesting things that you've found in that regard?
Regarding the dragon, that was actually directly quoted also by Origen. There is this passage by Aratus, I think it's the Phenomena. So it was an ancient description of the skies, where he says, on the sky the dragon is coiling. It's a great marvel. It's a terrible vision. So precisely, there was this idea that the constellation of Draco had to be the symbol of the greater serpent that encircled the world. So exactly, that was part of the system. We have this surviving rituals of the 5 seals of baptism, I think it's called, if I'm not remembering mistakenly. And the issue there was precisely what you mentioned, that is this sort of journey meant to be afterlife, or is this journey meant to be an initiation in this life? And that is an interesting, I think, question to ask about the ritualism of the Gnostics, if there was such a thing. And it seems pretty much to me plausible that it was sort of a death simulation ritual, where they sort of ritualized death, so to speak, where they have had to answer to these different gates, and they received the different seals that were, they were sort of the sign and at the same time the key to go beyond those places of darkness. Which is what is directly illustrated in the Deified diagram, indeed. Actually, I think it's the Gospel of Thomas that mentions if you don't receive initiation in this life, basically when you go to the next one, you will achieve nothing. And the other question that is, I think, a very interesting one, a very broad one, is that different Gnostic denominations, if we can call them that way, seem to have different beliefs in reincarnation as well. So you could actually not ascend and get thrown back into this world in different ways. We also have a hermetic doctrine of that in the Corpus Hermeticum. And that actually depended, that was sort of a samsaric system, but depended on the zodiac. So actually your zodiac sign was the way in which you were going to reincarnate into an animal. So it was a bad vision of the constellations that just got you back into into the animality or into the elements. So yeah, I don't know if I am answering this idea. These are just also wild speculations, but yeah, I think it was meant to be a ritual, an initiatory ritual that pretty much simulated a death in this life. So yeah.
And so, talk to me about the Sibylline oracles, or I think in your text you say the Sibylline dialogues. Am I pronouncing that right? I don't know, but yeah. What have you learned about that and the history of that, and what they contain, those dialogues or those oracles? Or
oh, I don't know if you're familiar with the text.
Not too much. I just kind of started listening to some things on it, but
yeah, I was also that sort of epilogue to Yao is like an imaginary conversation with Blake, and it was sort of the most freestyle part of the book, because it's just like tripping and imagining what Blake could answer to my ideas, what I could answer visually as well to Blake. The Sibylline oracles are actually a corpus of oracles, so texts attributed to the different Greek oracles of the ancient world that were actually kept by the Christians. So we have this tradition that it seems that for a good while Christians actually believed and kept oracles from the ancient world, in the belief that they actually spoke about Christ and the coming of their own revelation, so to speak. And that was actually, I think there is an apocryphal letter of Peter criticizing other Christians that believe in the Sibyls and believe in these pagan women that are actually giving them prophecies under states of altered states of consciousness. So it seems that it was already a controversial thing within Christianity, that Christians believed that the ancient oracles could actually speak about them in a way to confirm their own faith. At the same time, we have these texts, I think by Plutarch, mentioning how oracles were disappearing in the ancient world. So he believed that oracles were slowly sort of going quiet. They were speaking less because the gods didn't want to talk to us in a very similar sort of degenerative idea of time within paganism, this idea that the gods slowly stop manifesting. And I would like to freely take this idea of the Sibylline oracles by this assertion that the oracles can keep speaking, they can keep manifesting all the time. And that's not something that we can control. That is something that the sort of religious systems sometimes try to shut down, try to control. And I think it's fun for me, the exercise of tracking that down within Christianity as a problematic, as an interesting problematic that allows creation. So yeah.
And so, with your inclusion of those, were those something that you were trying to illustrate a point, or were the oracles? Did they play like a dominant role in the Ophite sect itself, in terms of the way that they kind of interacted with things in their world?
Not that I know of, but it seems that the Ophites and at least the branches of Gnosticism attributed to Basilides of Alexandria, they were way more based on the sort of Hellenic pagan side. Well, you have Christians and Gnostics basically from stemming from these sort of Jewish groups, and also stemming from Roman and Greek pagans, essentially. And it actually made a big difference on where they came from regarding what deities they were incorporating into their Gnosticism. So that's very interesting that you can sort of divide to a certain extent, but you also have wild connections in many texts that just mix Jewish and Greek and Roman lore in many creative ways. And I think that is the richness of early Christianity, that it was super mixed, super complex. And I really want to point that out within the Sibylline oracles. But I don't think they were connected to the Ophites, as far as I know. Although the Ophites also seem to take a lot of Greek tradition into them, of course.
There's something that I heard you touch on a little bit, but I don't know if you expanded too much on it in one of your interviews, where I think you were talking about some of the early church fathers and how they were relating to the Ophites, and there was some kind of controversy between Celsus and Origen. Does that ring any bells?
Yeah, so it seems Celsus wrote this book against the Christians, literally. So Celsus was trying to undermine the Christians. He was openly criticizing them. And Origen, in the good fashion of the ancient world, answered with another book. So that was the Roman way of doing things. You just write another full book trying to refute this guy philosophically. And that's why Celsus was accusing the Christians broadly in general of having the Ophite diagram. And it seems that he also described the Ophite diagram in this book against the Christians that is now lost. So that's a void that we have, because we don't preserve, as far as I know, the book by Celsus, but we preserve Contra Celsus or Contra Celsum, which is the response by Origen. And Origen actually responds by saying, no, these guys are not Christians. These guys that are having these diagrams and these strange rituals, they are this strange snake worshipping people, and they are not they're not one of us, basically. So you can see early Christianity already fighting with each other, and he's trying to define Christianity to actually defend himself against his enemy. So that's a very interesting sort of controversy within a controversy.
Yeah. So the sort of Ophite Christology, we see Christ as the salvific snake. Is that right? Could you expand on that a little bit, and how what things you found that really illustrate that, and what that means and everything?
Yeah, basically, well, that idea is still amazingly insane to me, because it simply turns everything on its head regarding Christianity and the way Christianity understands the world. So I just thought it was absolutely fascinating, and that Christ was this manifestation of the serpent under human form, basically in human shape. And so essentially, the Messianic times, so the Messiah had appeared in Genesis already as the snake speaking to Eve. So that was sort of Christ's moment for them. And he had appeared, so he had manifested in this world later to them, but it's not clear in which way. So there are many Gnostic trends that don't assert that Christ ever existed, or that he didn't have a body, or that maybe he wasn't a historical figure. So they were actually basically from scratch denying the historical base for Christianity. It was not a concern for them. And I think it's one of those extremes, is basically asserting he's the serpent of Genesis that is sort of manifesting to us in these revelations, but he's not meant to be a historical figure. It's completely on the symbolic level. And I think that's the most extreme aspect of in general of a lot of Gnostic trends, that they didn't need this historical basis that Christianity sort of depends a lot of the times upon. So yeah, I think that is pretty crazy, but I haven't been able to find an actual image of the serpent Christ, and that's why it's the opening picture, although it's a little one of Yao, because we have all these iconographic traditions on the image of Christ, but we don't really find them together with the snake in such a way. Yeah. So yeah, I think that was the main iconography to reconstruct.
Aside from the historicity part, symbolically, in terms of what the salvific snake represents, between the Ophites and maybe some other early Christianities, is there a lot of big difference in terms of the idea of what Christ meant to the Ophites versus these other sects, or is it vastly different, or is there some crossover still, even though the symbol is sort of different?
Well, I would say the main problem is the contradiction with the Old Testament, or the fact that basically for mainstream Christianity, Christ is the incarnation of the Old Testament God. And he sort of confirms, he has to confirm the Old Testament truths, if we can put it that way. And for example, we have Marcion, this heretical teacher, if you want to call it that way. And Marcion just made this antithesis, trying to demonstrate all the points in which the New Testament was completely in opposition to the Old Testament, and that they couldn't fit into one narrative. I think that's a pretty straightforward problem for anyone reading the Bible. But the problem is even stronger if you want to say that it's the snake opposing the Creator God. But at the same time, of course, you have the issue that the snake and the passages that they choose for the snake are from the Old Testament. So at the same time, you have it's the snake of Genesis, and the other main symbol for them is the staff of Moses, the brazen serpent that Moses raises in the desert. And that is their symbol for Christ, which is also paraphrased in John. So it's not the same as in Marcion. They were not basically anti-Jehovah, anti-Old Testament. They were actually using the Old Testament, but to assert something that was completely unheard of, completely new, or that is completely unheard of for us nowadays. But I think it's yes and no, because some Gnostics wanted to reject it altogether. But in this case, they were using this to prove their own. So actually, there is a very interesting bit that I think that is the fake part in Origen, that says, he says, if you want to be accepted into their assembly, you have to deny Christ, deny Jesus. I think he says Jesus.
Oh, wow.
And I think that's the fake part, because he was basically saying you have to blaspheme against our Jesus. But I wouldn't say that holds any water, because for them, the snake was Christ. So there is no contradiction for them. They are using the same Bible to assert another thing. So yeah, I think it's part of this strange cosmos, but I don't think it has to make sense all the time. It's part of the richness.
It's also fascinating. I wonder if you've found any connecting dots or just anything interesting with the Ophite sort of ideology versus some things that maybe were popular in early culture in Ireland. And I just wonder, because I asked because it might be just related to ancient Druidic ways of belief, but there was this story about St. Patrick like ridding the snakes of Ireland or something along those lines. But people will always bring up that there was no snakes in Ireland. So I think they're speaking symbolically, saying he was maybe eliminating like the pagans or the ancient Druidic type of religious belief system type things. But I didn't know if there was any like sort of Ophite connections that you've ever come across with any of that. So I was just wondering.
Honestly, I know almost nothing about Irish mythology. I would like, of course, to learn more. But the fun thing is that the serpent cult, as a pre-Christian thing, is almost universal. You know, every day, just like today, I find some more facts on serpent worship, and it's wherever you look. So no, I don't know any about that, but it's fascinating, and I'm gonna have to look for that, because wherever I go, I find there was serpent worship, but before Christianity. And actually, the weird case is monotheism and Christianity itself, because they are the only not worshiping snakes. so yeah.
Talk to me about your personal religious practice and maybe Christianity as you see it. Like, do you vibe with the Ophite view, or do you have kind of a mix? Or yeah, just out of curiosity, I wonder. Because you've done a lot of different investigations, so I would love to like get a sense of where you kind of see things at least currently. Everything's always, maybe up to change, but.
Well, I usually don't speak about praxis by itself, but my position is I think it's quite funny also for me, because I'm very committed to the study of Hinduism, and lately a bit more into the practice of it. But I feel that I belong to Christianity even if I don't like it, basically. So I sort of, my mindset of symbols is within Christianity, because I was raised Catholic. And actually, this sort of fight position is sort of the checkmate that I want to design to sort of rewire my conception, my symbolic conception that it has to be Christian in the end, but I don't like it that way. So I am finding that Gnosticism gives you a new configuration to understand the same symbols that you were raised into. So that is pretty much the design I would like to take. I would never say that I am a Gnostic. Maybe I would say that I am a Gnosticist. It's more like saying you're Buddhist because you're not claiming to be Buddha. So I wouldn't say I'm a Gnostic because I don't claim to have ultimate knowledge of what this means. I am doing my best to reconstruct the symbols, but I don't claim to have the ultimate enlightenment on that. But I would say it has been my way to cope with the Christianity that I was raised into, and to understand it in perspective with other religions, and to grow my own version of it. And I hope that helps to the ones that are interested into those ideas. Because what I want to offer is, I would say it's not a spiritual path by itself. I want to offer tools. My artwork is my personal way, but I also want it to be a way of learning for myself and maybe for others. So that's pretty much my position. If I would try to define it.
Awesome. There's a book that I saw on one of your posts. It was called Los Gnosticos, I think, or something. Do you know what is that book about? I don't know if there's an English version or if it's Spanish. Is that like a Gnostic text that talks a little bit about different types of stuff? Or?
Yeah, I think it was one book next to the Ophite diagram drawing. That is the Spanish Gredos edition of the Origin text. But this Los Gnosticos is basically just called the Gnostics. It has 2 volumes, and it includes the main heresiologists. So in this case, it has Hippolytus of Rome, Irenaeus of Lyon, and Origen of Alexandria, basically, which are the 3 fathers that try to refute Gnosticism. And it's sort of the official Spanish translation. I think so far a very good one. So yeah, it was just the main source in this case. So yeah, that is the Origin edition that I was primarily working from. Yeah.
So something I read that you did in your work, A Second Nature, was that you kind of codified the images with a system of steganographia, kind of in the Trithemian technique. And I thought that was really cool. And I've always found Trithemius just very interesting. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that sort of codification process a little, and what you were hoping to do with that.
Well, the other person I've been working a lot with is Frater Acher. We did another book on Trithemius, and to me, I would say it was more actually a game that I want to slow down reading on the images, and that is something that I found very interesting when it comes to images that are iconotextual, that they have a text within the image. They are not only a vision that you can have quickly. They require meditation, and that happens a lot within mystical art. And I was super interested in how to slow the reading down, to force the viewer to contemplate more. And that was one way, although it might be a bit of a puzzle for puzzle's sake, I would say at this point. But I, of course, think that's always good, because it forces you to have a different reading than the one we have by default nowadays. We think that a world of images is a quicker world. And I don't think that's the case. You can have also slow readings of images, and images that you can reflect upon. And what I'm mostly interested lately is how much, when it comes to iconography and when it comes to visions and so much more, you can actually see something, look at something, and not see beyond, and not see what it means, even though it's in plain sight. And that happens a lot with artwork, that you can, after learning something else, you can look at it, and then you find out something that was always in front of your eyes. So I love that feeling when I wanted to sort of encrypt these texts. that how do you make an image that at the same time reveals and hides something? And that is, I think, also implied in the word revelation, that you unveil something, but then you cover it again. And that is a mystical pattern that I really like. This idea that they are actually showing you the truth, but only for a moment, only for a minute. And if you don't get it, that's that's your problem. But I think that's also part of the game. That's a very mysterious aspect that I wanted to capture.
Yeah,
although I don't know, but yeah,
I think it's really cool, and it's kind of reminds me. I used to look at a lot of these old kind of alchemical images, and they're very codified. Like they, sometimes they'll have Latin phrases or alchemical symbols and Hebrew or whatever. But it's really cool in the process of kind of deciphering the different symbols. It really allows you to contemplate deeply and absorb how things are connecting. So I think that is a lot of what you're doing, and that's really great. So, and I think it was a Second Nature. There was a part about the role of the metamorphosis in ancient magic and the divine feminine. Was that a Second Nature? Is it?
Yeah, that's a second.
Wondering if maybe you could elaborate on that a little bit and some interesting things about that.
Yeah, I had this very strong interest in the images of metamorphosis, how they are reflected in ancient art, and also how they are basically what metamorphosis is the main activity of ancient magic, if you can call it that way. That's basically what the magicians do in the ancient world. And of course, we don't really know how that was meant to be reflected in the ritual praxis. But I was also very interested in these recent years to see how that was also reflected in pre-Columbian America. So in Peru, where I'm from as well, basically what the magicians used to do, or were said to do, was morph into animals, transform themselves. And this was not always understood as literal. You were not meant to become a deer or a pig, but it was an inner transformation. And so the main transformation that I sort of work upon in A Sacred Nature is basically the man that becomes a dragon, in this case, or a snake, which are also very, very much interrelated. And I think that's also an assertion of an antithesis, because in the Christian idea, we have this sort of archetype that the image of Adam is opposed to the image of the snake, that the image of the man is radically opposed to the image of the snake or the dragon. There is its antithesis, its opposites, and how do you unite the opposites, I think, was the most interesting part, which takes us again to the Ophite Christ in the end, that is both. So yeah, I don't know if I'm just connecting dots right now, but pretty much, yeah. And I would say also that A Second Nature was way more intuitive. I don't think I'm really able to explain every image in A Second Nature anymore, or if I ever was, because it wasn't a conscious work in the same way as Yao has been. And maybe that's also the interesting part of it, because it was a completely different process. I was way more associating images with images instead of thinking on their background more carefully. And I think that's also a stage that I would like to come back to on a more mature level after these publications for probably future works. So yeah.
I love this sort of thing, incorporating these images and trying to use visual depictions to capture depth of ideas and convey messages. And there's kind of a scarce amount of people out there doing that sort of thing, which is why I think it's so amazing. Like your work, I think like David Heim Smith is another, just amazing, that sort of thing. So I hope that it becomes something that we get more people out there expanding on and doing. I just want to throw that out there. But so I saw a website with one of your, I think it was A Second Nature book, and it was categorized as the left-hand path. And I think I've heard people describe what the left-hand path really is something along the lines of like a tantric Indian tradition that seeks the divine kind of in things that would otherwise be considered taboo or ugly or subversive, and kind of seeking God in the lowest places. So I was wondering, do you feel like that is an accurate categorization for that book, or would you view it as something different?
That's very interesting that it was labeled that way. I actually, well, of course, have an interesting and strong interest in Indian traditions and in Tantra. But it's very interesting how also the term left-hand path has been applied in the West. I have never used it actually myself to refer to the Western tradition, because I don't feel like I could pinpoint what it is really in what we call the occult so broadly. Yeah, it's quite a puzzling idea. I think it's fun to see it to see my book there. But yeah, I mean, it's usually what we refer to precisely as this, precisely what we started with, the transgressive spirituality, the spirituality that really requires consistency, but it's also transgressive in many ways. And I think we don't have an equivalent of that in the West, and that's why we have sort of take this an aphorism of left-hand path and applied it to what we see. I think Conce had this very nice term, which was sort of antinomian practices. I think would work in that case, because they're referring to praxis that goes beyond the established laws of society. That would work better, although the left and right hand allegorical speech is also in the Bible. In fact, you also have God, I think in Isaiah, speaking of the right hand of God and the left hand of God, but it hasn't been defined as a path as it has in India, actually, with Devamachara. So yeah, it's a puzzling point, I think.
Yeah, it is. It's
I wouldn't use it, but it doesn't bother me, to find myself there. So yeah,
it's something that I've been, just kind of hearing different takes on. It's one of those words or terms that some people have drastically different views on what it means. So I've kind of just been trying to, figure out for myself too.
I think it's because we don't really have a word to speak about Western spirituality that tends to be transgressive, that tends to go beyond the sort of Christian laws that are the default in modern Christianity. So, but historically, those things were not that well defined. That's an interesting thing with Tritemius, for example, that he was into the clergy. You can find priests doing black magic all the time throughout the Middle Ages. So it's not clear cut. I think that's the problem when we try to define it in the West. But yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about black magic, because that's another one. I think something people, if they hear things like the left-hand path or black magic, I think a lot of people think like evil or like causing harm or something along these lines. I don't know if that's the case, like in terms of black magic, as you're referring to it with Trithemius. What would you describe that as?
Well, in this case, I would refer more to necromancy. So the practices that were meant to communicate with the dead or with the daimons, basically, that were this. Actually, the daimons used the corpses sometimes, and sometimes that was used for harm, intended for it, or sometimes it was just meant to give you revelations of different sorts. In that case, I would pinpoint it to necromancy. Yeah, there is this, for example, this very interesting account of Benvenuto Cellini, this sculptor in the Renaissance, and he actually witnessed black magic ritual in the Colosseum, invoking the souls of the dead. And it was conducted by a priest that was paid to do so. So I don't know, that would be my go-to example of black magic in the West, and how it was for a long time, also carried in many levels at the same time. Yeah.
All right. And then, so this is what I was going to ask you. It's another thing that's interesting. I always ask this to different guests because I usually get a little different answers, but I feel like you're pretty knowledgeable. And so, in terms of your understanding, your research, your reading, your interactions with people, what is Satanism, or maybe Satanisms? Like, it seems like there's different versions or strains, or perhaps I don't know, if you were to sum up like common things or ideologies or beliefs that fall under that category or that correspond, what would you describe? What is that? Like,
I don't know if I'm in a position to answer that because I wouldn't say I'm a practicing Satanist. I think it's pretty much been defined in the 20th century by LaVey. So it's been a form of more, I would say, more morality than religiosity that has been sort of defined against this sort of default morality of Christianity. And it aligned itself also with a lot of occult practices, but in a very loose way. I don't really know to which extent that has been kept consistent within the many denominations. Also, I know there is theistic Satanism, so asserting a belief in the devil, so to speak. And going back to Neophytes, they are basically the earliest form of what could be defined as a form of Satanism, because of course the snake actually became identified, of course, with Satan. But again, it would be sort of stretching the terms too much, because the interesting thing is that Satan wasn't defined in Christianity until probably much later, or at least when the apocalypse was allowed into the canon. And that's where we have the mention, that old serpent, which is the devil and Satan, and then the red dragon. So yeah, I think to me, the Ophites were a very interesting sort of response to that, trying to find the roots of this antinomian doctrine, without recurring to the phenomenon of Satanism that to me looked pretty modern. But still, I don't know enough about it as such, but I think it's been an interesting sort of contraposition in modernity as a historical.
I guess
Yeah.
Satan as the accuser is a pretty well, people will describe that in terms of the Old Testament. That's kind of what that archetype represented, which maybe would be kind of strange in opposition to the Christic sort of archetype or representation. So yeah, I don't know, maybe that'd be weird, but it is fascinating just to kind of wrestle with those ideas. So in all your research and looking around at different aspects of the Ophites and trying to glean and get any insights and information, in doing so, what were maybe a couple of things that you've come across that you've found are just like super interesting or make you curious and want to learn more about, or maybe there's some other things to uncover that you're kind of hoping you'll stumble across, or anything like that?
Well, there is so much scholarship on Gnosticism, and probably not that much on the Ophites themselves, but there is still so much more stuff that I have discovered after and during making Yao that it's overwhelming. There is this big disconnect between the outside public and the scholar sources and the scholarly work of Gnosticism that is completely abstract and super, super hard to research. And there is so much that I would like to delve into there. But my visual connection and a lot of the stuff that I've been finding here in Rome that is super interesting is how to connect it to the gemstones that the Gnostics supposedly made, that are the actual remains that we have. And that was actually I think a first source that I was taking, and that I would like to take much further, because there are so many cabinets filled with these gemstones that are by default so small and so mysterious that they are actually understudied. So some written sources of Gnosticism are overstudied, so to speak. They have tons of scholarship, super abstract, But a lot of this visual remains, they remain unstudied, and we only have a lot of catalogs, mentioning what little we know about them. And I still get surprised when I find more and more of those in different collections, different catalogs, and I'm always like, wow, why did we never see this sort of deity? You have such amazing images there. So yeah, I think that's my current point, and there's so much I want to draw based on more stuff that I have been able to find there.
Yeah, I think I've seen, maybe it was on one of your lectures on YouTube, and there's some different like gemstones with like Abraxas iconography or something on there. Are there some patterns that you found in researching these different stones and gemstones that are like pretty dominant symbols that keep reoccurring throughout?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, one very funny thing is that the Abraxas, so the figure that has this rooster head and the serpent foot, those gemstones actually almost never say the word Abraxas in themselves. They have other words. One of them is actually Semesilam, so the eternal sun is what is carved a lot of the times along that image. So it was a fun sort of inside observation that I had. And for example, Charles William King, he attributes one gemstone to the Alphites, and it only has one serpent on one of its sides, and the reverse, the other side says Abrasax, which is basically the word that we have for that. So I think that's an interesting pattern, that the inscriptions don't really fit. And a lot of the times, actually, the gems that have this composite being, the panteos, they also call it, when it's the rooster-headed giant. A lot of the times that actually only says Yao as well.
It took me a while to learn how to pronounce that. When I look at it, I was just like IAO. But yeah, so is that root to any definitive, is it like Greek or the language of that IAO?
Yes. Mm-hmm. I loved it for the title because it's so simple, but at the same time we don't really know how it's meant to be said, IAO, so Yao, it's just the transcription into Greek of the name Jehovah. So it's meant to be the Hebrew for Jehovah, but in Greek you didn't have the equivalent sort of script, you didn't have the equivalent vowels and consonants to make it, so they actually made the 4 letters into 3 and in this inscription. And later it basically became identified with Gnostic scriptures, because that's how you find it a lot of the times, and that's how you find it in gemstones. And I think it's very telling that the 4-letter name becomes a 3-letter name with this Gnostic implications as well. And I also love it, something that is very profuse for example, in the magical papyri. I don't know if you're familiar with those in the Greek magical papyri, and that also happens a lot in the gemstones, is you have also just strings of vowels. So a lot of the times you have a charm that just says like and it was probably just meant to be a ritual chanting of some sort. A lot of times it's sad when some editions don't copy the full vowels, because I feel that you're left without the actual incantation that you're meant to chant. And I really like that about the name Yao, that it actually harkens you back to that sort of primordial pronunciation. It's like I feel it's like a primordial sound that is harkening back to it beyond its name. Yeah.
What are some of the popular locations geologically that a lot of these stones are found? Is there some sites that are like pretty dominant where a lot of them are found?
Now we have a lot of European collections that have sort of, during the Renaissance, actually they became quite fashionable, and a lot of them were actually fakes done in the Renaissance and the first Renaissance. That's very interesting. So a lot of them are actually in Italy. You also have a lot of them in the National Library in France. There is a very, very beautiful example at the Metropolitan in New York that, of course, they bought when they could. So yeah, you have cabinets with them in almost all major European museums. But it seems that the point of production was pretty much Alexandria in Egypt for a while. that's where Basilides of Alexandria was meant to have started his version of Gnosticism. But interestingly enough, also King mentions that there are Abraxas stones that have even been found in India, because there seems through Bardesanes, through this proto-Gnostic Bardesanes, to have been connections with the whole Middle East, with Syria and India, with the sort of late Roman Empire that was connecting even up to somewhere in India, so in North India. So that is super interesting, because I think these are mainly traveling objects that were meant to be passed from hand to hand. And by default, they are connecting. They are not steady objects because they are super small. So you can trace them back to certain places, but they were actually just like coins that were meant to be movable as talismans. So yeah.
Have any of them, to your knowledge, been like carbon dated or anything like that? Have they pinpointed any of that stuff?
Yeah, most of them I think are between the 2nd century AD to the 5th century AD. And actually, there are also later ones, and the tendency to identify them from and to tell them apart from the fakes that have been done in the 1400s, in fact, is that the Renaissance fakes are so much better done. So the Renaissance fakes are beautiful, but that's how you can tell they are actually the fakes, because the technique for carving hard stones actually fell in disuse. So it was slowly getting lost as the Roman Empire started collapsing. And so they couldn't carve them in the same quality as they used to do in ancient times. And so you can actually tell the original ones a lot of the times because they're actually quite ugly. They're quite sort of not well done, but that is very interesting because it's a very slow, rough, almost glyph-like drawing sometimes. So yeah, they almost have like almost like a graffiti feel sometimes. Like they are super basic sometimes.
Are there any particular points in regards to the ophites, any of your research, I mean anything in general, that you feel is something necessary that you want to include for the listeners, that you find is something that would be significant to be aware of? Anything like that.
Hard one. So I think they are basically the Hellenic version, but at the same time they take this very strong Old Testament sources. So I think, to me, also one of the main messages in the book Yao was that Gnosticism does not mean dualism, an extreme sort of rejection of the world. And if I could pinpoint something conceptually that is, I think, very important, is that because we tend to assume, to sort of summarize Gnosticism in general as this dualistic idea that the world is evil, maybe God is evil as well, and you only have to escape, and that's it. And it's a very simple form of pessimism that has a lot of the times become synonymous with Gnosticism by default. And I think that's a gross misunderstanding, because essentially the snake, what the snake is telling Eve and Adam and Eve is the world is not bad. You can eat the fruit and you will become like gods and understand good and evil. But the garden as it is, it has to be a nice place. it has to be a reflection of divine realities. So actually, I think there was an important element of embracing the world in Gnosticism, in many forms of Gnosticism. Of course, there was also very strong negative currents, but I think the important point, actually to pinpoint it would be that it's not only dualism, that it's something beyond, and the snake specifically implies that to me.
Yeah, definitely. What are 2 or 3 of your personal favorite books?
That is also a hard one because that's changing all the time. There is this book called Idolatry by Moshe Halbertal. I think it's by Harvard, and it's super interesting. It's really, really well done, well researched, and also easy to read. So yeah, that's a beautiful one. It's basically the concept of idolatry in the Old Testament. So he's examining it from the Jewish perspective, scholarly. But his main thesis is super interesting to me, is that basically idolatry is linked to sexuality, and it means it's always connected to sexual misconduct. So the idolatrous people are always or at the same time mentioned to be infidels, not only sort of on faith, but also sexually, and it goes beyond. And he has this hypothesis that sort of the contract between the chosen people and God is basically a marriage contract. That when they go with other gods, it's basically like a very toxic relationship within a marriage. That is so, and I thought that was very interesting symbolically, how he was treating this idea of the sexual contents of idolatry. That was super fascinating to me. Polyphilos dream, or Hypnerotomachia polyphili. I can write it down lately because it's a long title. I think it's one of the most beautiful books of the Renaissance, done in the Renaissance. I think it's 1499, if I'm remembering right.
Is there an English translation of that?
Yeah, I think it's just the English version by Jocelyn Godwin is just Polyphilos' Dream, or the Strife of Love in a Dream. And it's just beautiful. It's just a very, very beautiful trip. Dante style, but in this sort of early Renaissance pagan imaginary worlds. And it's also an interesting mix of antiquities as they were perceived in the 1400s and imaginary reconstructions of antiquity. And I just think that as a book, design-wise, it's sort of my ideal. Actually, when we wanted to design Yao, that was my reference, basically. I want the layout to look like this. So yeah, so that is a favorite of mine. Also aesthetically, you know. What else? I'm thinking of yet another one that I could pinpoint.
What's a book that really has drastically shifted or impacted your worldview, or maybe something that's really kind of like stuck with you over time that kind of shifted your perspective on things? Maybe
that would be quite a jump, but I would say the Kena Upanishad. So that's a Hindu text, but that was we could study that one and do our own little translations with our Sanskrit professor, and I think that is one of the most fascinating texts that I have ever encountered. So the Kena Upanishad is full of riddles, because Kena basically is the first question: who? But by who does the world basically move, and by who does the wind blow, and so on. So it's full of riddles. It's almost like a revelation made of riddles, and I think it's absolutely wonderful. If I can sort of last minute introduce something from the Sanskrit tradition, I think that's the one.
Yeah,
definitely.
Okay, I got one more question. It's kind of a vague one, but I feel like your artwork has a lot of this to it. You like, the deep reds, and there's a lot of imagery around like sacrifice. I wanted to see if you could just speak to what sacrifice means to you, what it means maybe to some of these ancient cultures, why it's so important. What do you think people should take away and understand about? I mean, it's a pretty open-ended question, but I think, just anything that comes to your mind, I'd love to hear.
Yeah, visually wise, this was an idea that was always stuck in my mind. The first time I was told this, and it just stuck in my artwork. You would see that when Christ appears in red, it means that he's already resurrected, because his cloth is completely drenched in blood. And I think I was pretty young when I heard that interpretation. And actually, when you see him in paintings of the apocalypse, usually medieval paintings of the apocalypse, he's always in red, because that means he has resurrected from the dead, and that's actually his blood. And that corresponds with a passage in Isaiah which is basically about the wrath of God, and then there the God says, you see that all my clothes are now red because they are drenched in the blood of my enemies on the day of wrath and so on. So I just thought that was super interesting, super shocking, super beautiful. And well, there was this idea, Jung actually mentions it, I think, in one of his writings on the Trinity, that and I just love how he words it, how he does the wording, that Christianity has sort of reinstaurated human sacrifice from ancient cults. And his way of putting it was quite interesting, because they are actually reasserting human sacrifice that was already out of use in antiquity, where they only performed animal sacrifice in reference. So that was a fun idea. And of course, sacrifice itself, I think we are very out of touch with that concept in the modern world, because we want things to be sustainable. We want things to be to make some sense, and we have a lot of it's quite of a problematic idea that I got from a Buddhist friend, but this idea that pity is not the same thing as compassion, and we have a lot of sort of soft pity, but we don't really feel compassion in a deeper level. So we only feel the superficial pity for things. And when you see the sacrifices of the ancient world, is something that is almost incomprehensible for a modern mindset, because sacrifices were about basically waste and just burning it all. So I think that's a very interesting point to confront and to question the modern mindset. And that is something that art allows me to do, because, of course, that's not something that you can just carry out any day. Because nowadays in the modern world, but that is an interesting consideration that artwork allows you to put to be confronted with. What is sacrifice about? What did sacrifice mean? And a lot of the times in modern times, we don't realize that sacrifice was about giving your best, essentially, giving the best that you have for that sacrifice. It wasn't by default. It wasn't sacrificing the things that were sort of left over and so on. It always had to be the most prized lamb and the most prized son and so on. So I don't know. It's also puzzling to me, but I think it's an interesting consideration. Yeah.
Beautiful. All right. Well, are there any last messages that you want to put out there? Maybe you can touch on what's coming up for you. Yeah, anything in general, if you want to, where people can find out more information about you, anything you want.
Well, just that I'm very thankful of how things have been carried out and how people have responded to Yao, and it's been almost overwhelming to me, the fact of how it has resonated and so on. I'm always impressed, and I'm always thankful of the responses that I get. And even though I find it, of course, from a public that is usually mostly interested in what you call the left-hand path, the funniest and the most beautiful review that I received from a friend that is very much into black magic and whatever, is that Yao actually taught me to appreciate Christianity in ways that I didn't expect to. And I was like, this is funny. This is very interesting. I wasn't expecting that either, but yeah, I'm always surprised on how it's been received. And I just wish that it opens dialogue. I don't want it to be unidirectional. I want that artwork to also motivate people to do their own artwork, to do their own connections, to do their own research. So I always want to be sort of open to discussion. I don't want to be the sort of last word on something or the owner of something as an artist. So yeah, that's what I want, and that's what I'm thankful about, essentially.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, I think I had heard you mention too. It's like, you're doing the best you can to represent these things, but you're totally open to, if people have ideas that they feel like they could be expanded on or improved. You're not trying to say this is, how it is. I'm saying everything exactly. So I love that you are very adaptive in that way, and you're always taking in and absorbing and learning and expanding. And I appreciate you greatly, and I appreciate you having this conversation with me. So I'm excited, looking forward to Yao coming out in paperback because I'm definitely going to get that. And your other one as well, The Eternal Sun. Or so, how do you pronounce that?
Semesiam.
Yes, that.
Semesiam. Yeah.
All right, brother. Well, I appreciate it, and yeah, till next time.
Thank you so much.